and welcome back to Carnegie Politica from the Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center in Berlin. I'm Eilish Hart, and today I'm speaking to Alexander Gabuev, the director of the Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center and a leading expert on Russia's foreign policy and its relationship with China in particular. Thank you for joining me, Sasha.
Thanks, Eilish. Great to be with you.
So our conversation is really well timed. We're recording on November 5th, less than a week after Donald Trump had his first face-to-face meeting with Xi Jinping since returning to the White House. And Russian Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin wrapped up a visit to Beijing yesterday. These meetings took place against the backdrop of Trump's trade war with China, new U.S. sanctions targeting Russia's largest oil producers, and of course, Russia's ongoing war against Ukraine. I'm really curious about what we should make of these developments. So let's briefly talk about Trump and Xi and then make our way over to Russia. So China's been a preoccupation for Trump since his first presidential term. He launched his first trade war with Beijing back in 2018. But after he met with Xi in South Korea last week, he announced that he had reached a trade truce with China. This seems like a pretty big change in tack in terms of Trump's policy. How significant was this meeting, and is this change as big as it seems?
I think it is pretty significant. And the parallel I'm making to Russia affairs is that there is a saying in the West that the Russians and Vladimir Putin only understand the language of strength. So you need to negotiate from a position of strength in order to get traction, attention, and then get you what you want, because the other side doesn't listen to the reason. It's precisely the same impression that the Chinese have dealing with Donald Trump and with the United States. As long as you don't have leverage, as long as you don't have tool to push back and punch Americans back, you don't get any traction. Your concerns, wishes, and so on are wiped away as unimportant, and America as the aircraft carrier just pushes through. And that's the perception of what has been happening in all of the trade and technological negotiations with Democratic and Republican administrations alike. I know that the consensus view in DC is somewhat similar about the Chinese, but I think that this Chinese view of the United States is deeply seated and supported by evidence if you try to jump into their shoes. So the weapons that the Chinese used after the so-called Liberation Day, weaponizing their dominant position in export of critical materials, rare earths, and magnets, and imposing restrictions, and then more well thought through export control mechanisms across the supply chain for not only the products, but also know-hows involved in refining those products and producing goods that become components or more sophisticated technological devices produced in the West. That has been their source of leverage that first got Trump back to negotiation table, sealed a truce, and now, after this meeting in South Korea, has sealed an agreement for a ceasefire for 1 year. And I think that the fact that the Chinese believe that they have found this leverage, found this magic pill to get America's attention, is informing their views on what's possible to do across the board, including in their relationship with Russia.
Let's keep Russia in the conversation. So earlier this week, Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin paid a 2-day visit to China where he held talks with President Xi. Beijing and Moscow then released a communique pledging a joint response to sanctions, or in their words, unilateral coercive measures. She also made comments reaffirming China's commitment to Moscow and said that strengthening ties was a strategic choice for both sides. What should we make of the timing of this meeting and the statements that came out of it?
This meeting was long in works. The traditional way that it works between Moscow and Beijing is that national leader of one country, of Russia, for example, goes to China, and in the same year, the Chinese prime minister goes to Russia. And then next year, the Chinese leader travels to Moscow, and then the Russian prime minister goes to China. So that's the normal calendar. And apart from that, there are a lot of ad hoc meetings because, for example, both countries are part of BRICS. And then BRICS summit happens in one of the countries, like it was in Russia, in Kazan last year. So there is an additional meeting. And the regular scheduled meeting is either tied to that or there is an extra visit. Or there is Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit. For example, this year, Prime Minister of Shanghai Cooperation Organization are supposed to meet in Moscow. So most likely Prime Minister Mishustin has traveled to China, but he will host his Chinese counterpart, Prime Minister Li Qiang, in Russia in the same year, like a couple of weeks from now. It just shows you the degree of frequency that senior most leaders of Russia and China, apart from Putin and Xi Jinping, like down below, there are a couple of players in the hierarchy that are seeing each other on regular basis. All of these meetings need to be prepared. For example, before Mishustin met his Chinese counterpart, there are 5 bilateral commissions on deputy prime minister level, where senior most Russian officials like Deputy Prime Minister Manturov in charge of industry, Deputy Prime Minister Chernyshenko, who is in charge of digital, and Deputy Prime Minister Novak in charge of energy. They all go to China, see their Chinese counterparts, prepare for the agenda. And then in order to prepare this deputy prime minister meetings, there are ministerial meetings, deputy ministerial meetings, and so on. So the intensity of exchanges between the two power system is really unprecedented in living memory. And since trade between Russia and China has expanded so dramatically as a result of the war, right before the war, the trade volume was around 145 billion US dollars a year. Now it's close to $250 billion a year. This year, we're seeing some decline because of decreased commodity prices. So Russian exports go down in value. And then Russia has purchased so much of Chinese cars and various tech products that the inventory is so large in Russia as the Russian economy is flat that Chinese will need to sell the stocks first. So the imports have gone down as well. But this is the largest trade relationship that Russia has. Up to 40% of Russian imports come from China, up to 30% of export revenues are also coming from China, and this share is increasing. So apart from this business relationship, there is like increasingly well coordinated, echelon layered bureaucratic relationship between the two power system that makes the overall ties much stronger. So when there is this notion in the West that, oh, it's just a romance between Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, I think it's much deeper than that.
I'm glad you kind of laid out the depths of this relationship. I mean, my understanding, largely from reading your work, is that the geopolitical alignment and trade relations between Moscow and Beijing have really only deepened as a result of Russia's war against Ukraine. But it seems as though the most recent U.S. sanctions, the ones targeting Russia's largest oil producers, may be proving disruptive. Earlier this week, Bloomberg reported that Chinese refiners are avoiding purchasing Russian crude oil because of these sanctions. How big of a problem is this for Russia?
I think this is a problem, but this problem is not insurmountable. And if past is any indicator for what is likely to happen, we know that the Russians and the Chinese will adapt and find multiple workarounds that will enable the flow of Russian exports to China, so Russian oil in that particular case, and then enable the Russians to get paid and finance their war effort in Ukraine. So here is how it works. Earlier this year, when Joe Biden's administration was leaving the stage, they sanctioned 2 large Russian oil companies, number 3 and number 4, Gazprom Neft and Surgutneftegas, put them on the blacklist, the SDN list of the US Treasury. So all of the transactions with them that are going through US jurisdiction, including US dollar and so on, are banned. And then dealing with those companies may risk you to get secondary sanctions. So if you're dealing with them, you may yourself end up on the American blacklist. So the Chinese, just as now in case of Trump's sanctions against number one and number two producers, Rosneft and Lukoil, have paused all the purchases for a couple of years. And then the market players, be it state-owned companies like CNPC, Sinopec, like the giants of the Chinese industry, or smaller private companies or companies where there is some state property involved, but that are mostly private, like small teapot refineries in northeast of China. They paused operations, trying to work out with their due deal teams and like sanctions compliance teams, and also most importantly, waiting for the word from Beijing on how to handle this. And then the word last time around, so this January, was continue to do business, but find schemes that help you to shield you from the risks. And that's exactly what Russia and China did in case of Gazprom Neft and Surgutneftegas. So the flow isn't interrupted. They use various schemes where Russia-China trade is not touching US dollar at all. The prime ministers, Mishustin and Litian, when they were meeting this week, were saying that it's fraction of percentage where they rely on currencies other than ruble and RMB. And RMB, the Chinese yuan, is predominant in settling this trade. They're not using any American or Western insurers. They're not using Western vessels. So they've created a whole infrastructure to be independent of the US financial system and other elements of the Western sanctions coalition. So, yes, using this infrastructure is expensive, and that eats into the profit margins of the Russian companies. But that's a price to pay for being in the business while at the same time being sanctioned. And I think that Rosneft and Lukoil are very likely to follow in the footsteps of these two other companies and use exactly the same tools. Most likely, this has been gamed by their leadership many times. So they have pretty elaborate contingency planning. Most likely, this contingency planning was war gamed with their Chinese counterparts. So both sides know exactly what they're going to do. The Chinese were listening to the orders from Beijing. And my takeaway from Xi Jinping's meeting with Trump is that Donald Trump has said that he has discussed Ukraine war with Xi, and Xi also wants to stop this war. But there was no strong language that America told China that if it dares to touch Russian oil coming from Rosneft, Lukoil, or other sanctioned entities, it will get retaliation as well. Well, because again, we go back to the beginning of our conversation. China now believes that they have this magic silver bullet that they can all the time threaten to use if Americans try to apply pressure to them on issues that are core national interest. And truth is that apart from benefiting from discounted Russian oil, maintaining energy security, keeping Vladimir Putin's regime afloat, making sure that this regime is not losing the war to the extent where it would threaten Vladimir Putin's grip on power in Russia, is in China's national interest, the way Xi Jinping and the Communist Party of China define it. And this is why it's very likely that we're going to see a lot of sanctions busting, adaptation, rather than China's compliance with Donald Trump's sanctions.
I'm glad you mentioned that Trump talked about his conversation with Xi about the war. I mean, as he put it, he said that he and Xi had talked about Ukraine for a long time and they were, quote, going to work together on Ukraine. Could you talk a bit more about where China stands on the Russia-Ukraine war at this juncture and whether there's any potential for Beijing to play a diplomatic role when it comes to peace talks?
I think that for now, China realizes very well that both sides, both belligerents, Russia and Ukraine, are still miles apart in what is an acceptable outcome. And both sides believe that they have resources and ammunition, both physical, literal ammunition, and also money and network of supporters to continue and establish the outcome on the battlefield. Russian theory of the war for now seems to be that Ukraine has compounded manpower problems. They have problems in their domestic economy. They cannot pay for the war. They are very much reliant on European support. And they go into a winter where Russia can impose really harsh costs by knocking out Ukrainian power grid, knocking out their gas production, terrorizing the cities, driving the population out of eastern part to a more safe western part, and then out to Europe. And all of these problems combined will ultimately lead to a gradual meltdown of Ukrainian armed forces, and then Ukraine will lose this war of attrition gradually and suddenly. So, at some point in time, 12 months down the road and 10 months down the road, Ukrainians will have to capitulate de facto and accept Russian conditions, which means surrendering part of their territory, putting a cap on the size of their armed forces, and most importantly, putting a cap on their ability to cooperate with Western intelligence services, militaries, for training, for weapons provision, and so on. And Ukraine becomes permanently neutral. Its road to NATO is foreclosed. And then Russia also insists on some provisions that will give it a say in Ukrainian domestic politics through use of Russian language and through utilizing the Ukrainian Orthodox Church that's part of the Moscow Patriarchy. So that's the Russian game plan. And they believe that Ukraine, again, is losing this war gradually and then suddenly. Ukrainian war plan seems to be that Ukraine will be able to hold the line for quite some time to wear the Russians down, to wear their manpower advantage down, where the Russians will have this advantage. They will still have more men. It's bigger, more populous country, but they will not able to get more terrain. And then the returns of the war effort will be diminishing, and then the economic cost of the war and the pain that the Ukrainians will inflict on Russia for their long-range strikes against Russian refineries or other military and dual-use targets will lead to cumulative acceleration of the war costs, where Putin will have to stop and settle for something. So territory that Russia has stolen from Ukraine will be remain stolen. Nobody in the world will recognize that. But there will be a ceasefire deal that cements Ukrainian ability to maintain its armed forces closely connected to NATO de facto, and this will be the strongest deterrent against further Russian invasion. And then Ukraine gets reconstruction, investment, and population comes back, and so on. So for now, the jury's out. Both sides believe that their case will be proven in the next 12 months. So China understands that if you try to get involved, you're probably not getting that much traction because the other side is just stubbornly convinced that its theory of the case may be superior to the opponent's side. So why would you intervene? They have some leverage over the Russians, but they also think like, okay, if we put pressure on the Russians in order to force Putin to accept a certain outcome that he doesn't want to accept at this point, why would we do that? What are we getting in return from the West? And for now, the West is not offering them anything that China is interested in. Well, China would be interested in the US fully removing any export controls against sophisticated chips and other tools that China needs for its own um, program for industrial development and scientific progress. Well, China would love to see the US saying, our security commitment to Taiwan is, yesterday's news. That's not really existent. And we actually are not opposed to reunification. That will not happen. But for example, or the Europeans removing tariffs against Chinese electric vehicles and allowing China to dominate industrial production in Europe. It's nice to have, but it will not happen for set of reasons unrelated to Russia-Ukraine war. They understand that it's about the Western economic survival, the global competitiveness, uh, and the West doesn't really offer China something of value in China's view uh, for its support on, bringing Putin to the negotiation table in earnest. And then the pressure toolkit of the West against China is also limited, precisely because of all of this new tools that China has. So they believe that they can sit on their hands, they can help Russia enough to stay in the fight. They can probably help Russia to get somewhat more successful. They are definitely agnostic about where the line of control is. They don't want to be appearing as in full-throated support for Russia's aggression and annexation, because they definitely support at least on paper, the principle of territorial integrity, and they apply that to their own cases with Taiwan and other parts of China. And they also don't want to be seen as enabling violation of international law in just like broad daylight. But below this threshold, they will do everything to keep Vladimir Putin in fight, to get beneficial sweet deals because of increasingly asymmetric relationship between Russia and China, and also to get a lot of know-hows and battlefield experience from this war. Because what's happening is that this horrible war becomes a test bed for both the West and Western opponents for its most potent toolkits. The war is evolving very rapidly. There is ongoing tech revolution connected with drones and use of artificial intelligence. The West is using this as a battlefield testing ground for its most modern toolkit. It's also very actively works with Ukrainian indigenous defense producers for all the right noble reasons of helping a sovereign country to defend itself against brutal aggression. But then on the Russian side, Russia works with Iran, with North Korea, and with China first and foremost in order to counter this Western innovation and test innovations of their own. And China is definitely one of the major beneficiaries. So I think this set of reasons uh, tells us why Xi Jinping will probably imitate his commitment to peace. He has this peace proposal, which is like, oh, let it be peace, not be war. And we are for everything good and against everything evil. That is co-signed with Brazil. But beyond that, it's unlikely at this point that Xi Jinping is ready to move a finger in order to put pressure on his friend Vladimir Putin and really force him into negotiation that accounts for Ukrainian vital and legitimate interests of maintaining their sovereign independent state.
Western policymakers, including Trump himself, like to talk about driving a wedge between Russia and China. Trump has argued that Russia and China should be natural enemies. However, you made the argument that Trump's policies, or rather his chaotic approach to foreign policy, has effectively pushed Putin and Xi closer together. Given all the recent changes we've discussed, is that still the case? Like, is the China-Russia relationship still on track to deepen, or are there points of friction that the Trump administration could seek to exploit?
3 points here. Number one, I think that there are structural reasons that China and Russia are increasingly aligned. And we can put the US out of the picture for a second, be it Trump or his predecessors. I think that unlike the Sino-Soviet split in the 60s, the 70s, and early 80s, now the Russians and the Chinese realize that they need to cooperate as large neighbors that share a very long border that used to be contested. But this is a border between two nuclear superpowers, which have their major security threats somewhere else. Their major security threat, as the Kremlin leadership perceives it, and as leadership in Junhan High perceive it, is with the United States of America. So they are not or don't need to be a threat to each other. Chinese population is aging and shrinking. There are no millions of hidden Chinese population in the Russian Far East. Yes, there is some nostalgia for territories that the Imperial Russia has annexed from Qing China. But as soon as the opportunity presented itself at the beginning of this century to really solve the border issue and seal it and put it to dust, I think that Russia and China jumped at this opportunity precisely because they didn't want to be preoccupied with other big conventional and nuclear military as a threat. So I think this is settled. Both sides have demilitarized the border significantly, and we are seeing that Russia and China increasingly are building cross-border infrastructure, bridges, various ways to move cargo around. That didn't happen before. And to me, that signals the level of Russian leadership being more relaxed about potential Chinese threat than ever before in history. So that's one. Two, Russia and China are just naturally complementary economies. Russia has abundance of raw materials, needs markets to sell them, needs tech, and needs money. China is the exact opposite. It is a huge market. It has really cutting edge technology. It's very rich, but it's poor in many natural resources. It has to import its oil, its natural gas, copper, and many other elements. So, sitting next door to each other, this is a match made in heaven, just like Russia and Europe before Russia's illegal decision to annex Crimea and assault Ukraine. So here there is big potential to be exploited, particularly, and the sanctions are fermenting this partnership because Russia has basically not that many doors to knock. And then third element is the similarity between the political systems. Yes, they are very different, but they are definitely not democratic. Uh, Russia has managed democracy. China has a socialist democracy with Chinese characteristics, where there are some democratic party that are not Communist Party of China, but they are, in definition of the Chinese constitution, are seated there to help the Communist Party to govern, but not to replace it. And as permanent members of the UN Security Council, Russia and China see eye to eye on so many issues of global governance. For example, responsibility to protect or governance of the internet, where Russia and China say, oh, wait a minute, like each national segment of the internet should be governed by the local rules, by the local government, and this universal freedoms of speech and so on are definitely not something that we are vetted to. So security along the border, complementarity of the economies, and similarities of political regimes would be three factors that are driving the two closer together. And then on top of that comes the secret sauce, the perception that Americans are out to get them, that Americans are seeking regime change, or that Americans are denying Russia and China their rightful place in this multipolar order. That also brings Xi Jinping and Putin together. So, with that, I think that the ability of Trump to drive a wedge between the two of them is really limited because they also see Trump as somebody who will be in charge for another 3.5 years, where they don't have a political calendar that presses them that much. Xi Jinping has abolished limitations as the president of China or PRC chairman. He didn't have these limitations as the Secretary General of the party or head of the party's Central Military Commission. So he can stay, and he's in his early 70s. So is Vladimir Putin, who is just 6 months elder than Xi Jinping. He has, according to the Russian constitution, till 2036, but then nothing prevents him, if he's in good health, to amend the constitution. So they have this long-term view, and they are likely to be around unfortunately, for quite some time, where Donald Trump might be out of the picture quite soon. So, why would you believe anything what Trump promises or anything what he does? And I think that my reading of Vladimir Putin's strategy is that he and his team are waving this carrot of potential Russia-China split in front of the administration knows as much as they can, sending private messages for various intermediaries like Kirill Dmitriev saying like, yeah, we are not very happy about this dependency, help us to get out of Chinese pocket. And then everything what the administration can offer, they pocket, but that doesn't deliver in real split between Russia and China. And I think that the Chinese are in total understanding of this position. That's exactly what they would do if they are playing Russia's cards. They're dealt with much stronger hand. But they are not very angry. And I think that there is a marked contrast between Trump 1, where Trump's outreach to Putin has really alerted Chinese decision makers. I encountered this questions from Chinese colleagues and Chinese officials many times, like, "Oh, how genuine is this rapprochement between Putin and Trump?" And then they discovered that there is nothing that Trump can really do, that the mainstream policies in the Republican Party was still to, sanction Russia and push back against Trump's outreach to Vladimir Putin. Well, investigation was ongoing and so on. I think right now the incentives are even less palpable for the Russians. But final point here is that Trump's sanctioning on Russia, which is meant to help Ukraine somewhat, or at least to defer criticism for being pro-Putin, is only driving Russia closer to China on Chinese terms and giving China more leverage in the relationship with Russia, which China is happy about.
Okay, I think we're going to have to leave it there for today. Thank you so much for joining me, Sasha, and for sharing your insight.
Thank you so much, Eilish. Pleasure to be with you.
If you enjoyed this conversation, let us know by liking or sharing this video or leaving a comment. And don't forget to subscribe for more expert interviews like this one. That was Alexander Gabuev, the director of Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center in Berlin. I'm Eilish Hart, and we'll see you next time on Carnegie Politica.